When the convoy of armored vehicles rolled through the checkpoint at dawn, nobody questioned the Red Cross ambulance bringing up the rear. The medic inside had all the right credentials, spoke with the soft authority of someone who'd spent years saving lives, and carried herself with the weary professionalism that comes from working in war zones. What the enemy soldiers didn't know was that beneath the stretcher where she kept her medical supplies, Rebecca Chen had concealed the most advanced sniper rifle in the American military arsenal. And in 6 hours, that rifle would change the course of an entire battle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung thick over Pine Ridge Medical Center as Rebecca Chen pulled her decade-old Honda Civic into the staff parking lot. At 5:47 a.m., she was already 13 minutes behind her usual arrival time. But the overnight shift supervisor wouldn't mind. Rebecca had earned a reputation over her 4 years at the rural Montana hospital as someone who could handle any crisis with calm efficiency, and her colleagues had learned to trust her judgment completely. She gathered her coffee thermos and worn leather satchel from the passenger seat, moving with the deliberate precision that characterized everything she did. At 34, Rebecca possessed the kind of understated competence that made her invaluable in emergency situations. She was neither the most talkative member of the medical staff nor the most social, but when trauma cases arrived by helicopter or ambulance, other nurses instinctively looked to her for guidance. The automatic doors of the emergency department slid open with their familiar whisper, and Rebecca nodded to Danny Morrison, the night security guard who was preparing to end his shift. Danny had worked at Pine Ridge for nearly 2 decades, and he'd seen hundreds of medical professionals come and go. But Rebecca Chen intrigued him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. There was something about her awareness, the way she seemed to catalog every person and potential threat in any room she entered, that reminded him of his own military service. "Quiet night?" Rebecca asked, checking the patient board mounted behind the reception desk. 3 stitches cases from the lumber mill, one elderly woman with chest pains who turned out to have severe acid reflux, and a teenage boy who thought he could impress his girlfriend by jumping off Copper Creek Bridge. Danny replied with a tired grin. Dr. Patterson handled the bridge jumper's broken wrist, and the old lady went home around midnight with a prescription for antacids and a lecture about late-night pizza consumption. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. These were the kinds of cases that made rural hospital work both challenging and rewarding. Unlike the massive trauma centers in major cities, Pine Ridge Medical served a community where everyone knew everyone else, where a broken bone or minor emergency became neighborhood news within hours. She made her way to the staff lounge, exchanging her civilian jacket for the navy blue scrubs that had become her uniform. The lounge was empty except for Sarah Mitchell, a younger nurse who was finishing her charting from the previous shift. Sarah looked up from her paperwork with obvious relief. "Rebecca, thank goodness you're here early. We've got that new resident starting today, and you know how Dr. Harrison gets when he has to train someone new while managing the emergency department." Dr. Marcus Harrison was Pine Ridge's chief of emergency medicine, a brilliant physician who'd given up a lucrative position at Seattle General to return to his hometown and serve the rural community where he'd grown up. He was also notoriously impatient with medical residents who couldn't adapt quickly to the unique demands of small-town emergency medicine. "What's the resident's background?" Rebecca asked, tying her long black hair back with practiced efficiency. "Fresh out of Johns Hopkins, specialized in trauma surgery. Name's Dr. Jennifer Walsh. Apparently, she requested an assignment to a rural facility because she wanted hands-on experience with diverse cases, rather than the specialized focus she'd get at a major urban hospital." Rebecca nodded approvingly. She respected medical professionals who sought challenging assignments rather than comfortable positions. It suggested the kind of character that valued service over personal advancement, a trait she'd learned to recognize and appreciate during her own unconventional career path. The emergency department at Pine Ridge Medical Center wasn't impressive by big city standards, but it was equipped to handle the most common medical crises that occurred in rural Montana. 6 treatment bays, 2 trauma rooms, a small surgical suite, and imaging equipment that had been state-of-the-art when it was installed 8 years earlier. What made the department exceptional wasn't its technology but its staff's ability to function as a cohesive unit under pressure. Rebecca began her morning routine, checking supply levels in each treatment bay, verifying that emergency medications were properly stocked, and reviewing the maintenance logs for critical equipment. This methodical approach to preparation was something she'd learned long before her nursing career, in circumstances where inadequate preparation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Dr. Harrison arrived at 6:15 a.m., followed closely by a young woman who could only be the new resident. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared to be in her late 20s, with sandy brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent green eyes that took in every detail of her new work environment. She carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations, but Rebecca detected subtle signs of nervousness in the way she adjusted her stethoscope and repeatedly checked her pager. "Dr. Walsh, meet Rebecca Chun, our senior emergency nurse," Dr. Harrison said without preamble. "Rebecca has more practical trauma experience than most physicians, and she's forgotten more about emergency medicine than most residents learn in their entire programs. If you're smart, you'll listen to everything she tells you." Rebecca extended her hand to the new resident, noting the firm handshake and direct eye contact that suggested confidence and professionalism. "Welcome to Pine Ridge, Dr. Walsh. We're glad to have another experienced hand on the team. Thank you." "I'm looking forward to working with you," Dr. Walsh replied. Dr. Harrison mentioned that you have an unusual background for a nurse. Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, or somewhere else on the East Coast. "Actually, I learned most of my medical skills in Afghanistan," Rebecca said simply, then changed the subject before Dr. Walsh could ask follow-up questions. "Let me show you our trauma protocols and equipment setup. We do things a little differently out here than they do in major medical centers." Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca guided Dr. Walsh through the emergency department's procedures, introducing her to the other staff members and explaining the unique challenges of rural medicine. Unlike urban hospitals where specialists were available around the clock, Pine Ridge required its emergency physicians and nurses to handle everything from cardiac events to complicated fractures to psychiatric emergencies. "The nearest neurosurgeon is 3 hours away in Billings," Rebecca explained as they reviewed the protocols for head trauma cases. "The nearest cardiac surgeon is even farther. That means we have to be absolutely certain about our assessments and treatment decisions, because once we stabilize a patient for transport, they're committed to a long journey that we can't easily reverse." Dr. Walsh asked intelligent questions about medication protocols, equipment limitations, and inter-facility transport procedures. Rebecca found herself impressed by the younger physician's willingness to acknowledge the learning curve she faced in adapting from a major teaching hospital to a rural medical facility. Their orientation was interrupted at 8:23 a.m. by the distinctive sound of the emergency department's radio crackling to life. Rebecca moved immediately toward the communication station, with Dr. Walsh following closely behind. "Pine Ridge Medical. This is Flathead County EMS Unit 7. We're en route to your facility with a high-priority trauma patient. Male, approximately 45 years old, involved in a logging accident approximately 30 miles north of your location. The patient sustained crushing injuries to the lower left leg, possible compound fracture, significant blood loss. 8:15 minutes." Rebecca keyed the radio microphone with practiced ease. "EMS Unit 7. This is Pine Ridge Medical. We copy your transmission. Do you have the patient's vital signs and current level of consciousness? Patient is conscious and alert. Blood pressure 90/55. Pulse 118. Respirations 24 and shallow. We've established 2 large-bore IVs and are running normal saline wide open. Patient is complaining of severe pain in the injured leg and some nausea, but he's maintaining his airway without assistance. Rebecca quickly calculated the implications of the information she'd received. A logging accident with crushing injuries suggested the possibility of complicated fractures, potential vascular damage, and the need for immediate surgical intervention that might exceed Pine Ridge's capabilities. She looked at Dr. Harrison, who had appeared at her shoulder. Trauma Bay 2, Dr. Harrison decided. Rebecca, get blood type and cross-match orders to the lab. Contact OR to put them on standby and check with radiology about availability for emergency X-rays. Dr. Walsh, this will be your first case here, so observe closely and don't hesitate to ask questions. Rebecca was already moving, pulling supplies from storage cabinets and preparing the trauma bay for the incoming patient. Her movements were economical and purposeful, each action flowing naturally into the next. Dr. Walsh watched with obvious admiration as Rebecca transformed the treatment area into a fully prepared trauma suite in less than 3 minutes. How did you learn to work so efficiently? Dr. Walsh asked as they waited for the ambulance to arrive. Rebecca paused in her preparations, considering how to answer the question without revealing more about her background than she intended. Experience, she said finally. You learn to move fast and think ahead when people's lives depend on your speed and accuracy. The ambulance arrived with its characteristic combination of flashing lights and urgent radio communications. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh joined Dr. Harrison at the emergency department entrance, where they met the EMS crew as they unloaded their patient. The injured man was conscious but clearly in significant pain, his left leg secured in a temporary splint. That couldn't completely disguise the severity of his injuries. Patient's name is Robert Taylor, works for Mountain View Logging. The lead paramedic reported as they transferred him to the hospital gurney. Tree fell unexpectedly during cutting operations, caught his leg between the trunk and a boulder. Crew used chainsaws and hydraulic jacks to free him, but he was trapped for approximately 40 minutes before extraction. In Trauma Bay 2, Rebecca and Dr. Walsh worked alongside Dr. Harrison to assess the patient's condition. The preliminary examination revealed extensive soft tissue damage and what appeared to be multiple fractures in the lower leg. More concerning was the patient's blood pressure, which had continued to drop despite aggressive fluid resuscitation by the paramedics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Walsh, what's your assessment? Dr. Harrison asked as Rebecca prepared blood samples for the laboratory. Significant trauma to the lower extremity with probable compartment syndrome, possible vascular compromise, and signs of developing shock despite fluid replacement, Dr. Walsh replied confidently. We need immediate imaging to assess the extent of bone and soft tissue damage, and we should consider emergency surgery to prevent permanent loss of function in the affected limb. Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. Rebecca, get Mr. Taylor to radiology for emergency X-rays, then contact Dr. Stevens at Billings General. We're going to need an orthopedic surgeon, and depending on what the imaging shows, possibly a vascular surgeon as well. As Rebecca coordinated the patient's care, she found herself drawing on knowledge and skills that went far beyond her formal nursing training. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, to anticipate complications before they occurred, and to communicate effectively with multiple medical specialists simultaneously wasn't something she'd learned in nursing school. These were capabilities she'd developed in much more dangerous circumstances, treating injuries far more severe than logging accidents. in places where the nearest hospital was thousands of miles away, and medical evacuation wasn't always possible. Dr. Walsh observed Rebecca's performance with growing amazement. The senior nurse seemed to anticipate every need, to have contingency plans for complications that hadn't yet occurred, and to maintain perfect situational awareness even while focused on specific medical tasks. It was the kind of clinical intuition that usually took decades to develop, yet Rebecca appeared to be only in her mid-30s. The X-rays revealed the extent of Robert Taylor's injuries, multiple fractures in the tibia and fibula, significant soft tissue damage, and evidence of compromised blood flow to the lower leg. Dr. Harrison made the decision to transport the patient immediately to Billings General, where orthopedic and vascular surgeons could attempt to save the injured limb. As the medical helicopter prepared to transport Mr. Taylor to the trauma center, Rebecca found herself thinking about the similarities between emergency medical situations and the combat operations she'd once participated in. Both required rapid assessment of complex situations, decisive action based on incomplete information, and the ability to function effectively under intense pressure while lives hung in the balance. That was impressive work, Dr. Walsh said as they cleaned and restocked Trauma Bay 2. You handled that case like you've been managing trauma patients for decades. Where exactly did you work before coming to Pine Ridge? Rebecca continued organizing medical supplies, not immediately responding to the question. She'd learned to deflect inquiries about her background without being rude or evasive, redirecting conversations toward more neutral topics that didn't require her to discuss her military service or the specialized training that had prepared her for situations far more dangerous than rural emergency medicine. Different places, she said finally. Medical experience transfers pretty well from one setting to another once you understand the basic principles. She looked up from her work to meet Dr. Walsh's curious gaze. The important thing is being ready for whatever comes through those doors next. In a place like Pine Ridge, you never know if the next patient will be a minor laceration or a multisystem trauma that tests everything you know about emergency medicine. Dr. Walsh accepted the deflection gracefully, but Rebecca could see that her curiosity remained unsatisfied. It was a reaction she'd encountered frequently since beginning her civilian medical career. Her colleagues recognized that she possessed knowledge and skills that seemed inconsistent with her official credentials, but they rarely pressed for detailed explanations. The rest of the morning shift passed without major incidents, allowing Rebecca to continue Dr. Walsh's orientation to the emergency department's procedures and protocols. She demonstrated the proper operation of specialized equipment, explained the hospital's relationships with regional medical centers, and shared practical insights about treating the kinds of injuries and illnesses common in rural Montana. A brief break in patient activity, Rebecca found herself alone with Dr. Walsh in the staff lounge. The younger physician had been quiet for the past hour, clearly processing her observations of how Pine Ridge Medical operated compared to the large teaching hospital where she'd completed her residency. "Can I ask you something?" Dr. Walsh said. As she refilled her coffee cup, Rebecca looked up from the medical journal she'd been reading. "Of course. This morning, during the trauma case, you made several suggestions about patient care that weren't standard protocols. The way you positioned Mr. Taylor for optimal blood flow, the specific 4 medications you recommended, the questions you suggested we ask about his injury mechanism. Those weren't things I learned in medical school or residency. They seemed more field medicine techniques." Rebecca closed her journal and considered her response carefully. She'd grown comfortable with deflecting casual questions about her background. But Dr. Walsh was a physician, someone whose professional judgment she respected, and the question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than idle gossip. "Sometimes the textbook approach isn't the most effective approach," Rebecca said. "Emergency medicine is about adapting to circumstances. using whatever knowledge and resources you have available to achieve the best possible outcome for your patient. But where did you learn those techniques? They seemed very specific, very refined, like they came from extensive practical experience with trauma cases under difficult conditions. Rebecca stood and moved to the window that overlooked the hospital's emergency helicopter landing pad. In the distance, she could see the mountains that surrounded Pine Ridge, their peaks still covered with snow despite the advancing spring season. It was a peaceful view, one that reminded her of how different her current life was from the years she'd spent in places where mountains might conceal enemy positions and peaceful landscapes could turn deadly without warning. Dr. Walsh, I learned emergency medicine by treating people who needed help in places where conventional medical resources weren't available, she said without turning from the window. The specific details of where and when aren't really important. What matters is using that experience to provide the best possible care for our patients here at Pine Ridge. Dr. Walsh joined her at the window, and they stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the morning activities in the hospital parking lot below. Finally, the younger physician spoke again. I respect your privacy, Rebecca. I can see that you have reasons for not discussing your background in detail. But I want you to know that I'm impressed by your clinical skills and your commitment to patient care. Whatever experiences gave you that expertise, I'm grateful that Pine Ridge Medical has the benefit of your knowledge. Rebecca turned from the window and offered Dr. Walsh a genuine smile, the first completely unguarded expression she'd shown during their morning together. Thank you. I'm here because I believe in what we do, and I'm glad to work with colleagues who share that commitment. The radio crackled again with an incoming IMS call, ending their conversation and drawing them back into the rhythm of emergency medicine. As they prepared to receive another patient, Rebecca reflected on how much her life had changed since leaving her previous career. The skills remained the same, the commitment to helping others remained constant, but the context had shifted dramatically from the battlefields where she'd first learned to save lives under impossible conditions to the rural hospital where she now served a community that had become her home. 3 weeks after Dr. Walsh's arrival at Pine Ridge Medical Center, Rebecca Chen had settled into a comfortable routine of mentoring the new resident while maintaining her own demanding caseload. The early June weather had brought an increase in outdoor activity throughout the region, which meant more hiking accidents, motorcycle crashes, and construction injuries flowing through the emergency department's doors. Rebecca had just finished restocking the pediatric treatment room when she heard familiar footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to find Margaret Thompson, the hospital's head of nursing, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression that usually preceded administrative requests Rebecca would rather avoid. Rebecca, I need to discuss something with you, Margaret said, settling into one of the small chairs designed for parents of young patients. At 58, Margaret had been working in healthcare administration for over 20 years, and she'd developed an intuitive ability to recognize exceptional talent among her nursing staff. If this is about overtime hours, I'm not complaining about the extra shifts, Rebecca replied, continuing to organize supplies while they talked. She'd learned that keeping her hands busy during administrative conversations helped her maintain emotional distance from topics that might probe too deeply into her personal history. Actually, it's quite the opposite. The Regional Medical Association has asked me to nominate one of our emergency nurses for their annual Excellence in Trauma Care Award. The nomination requires detailed documentation of the candidate's educational background, professional achievements, and specific examples of exceptional patient care. Rebecca's hands paused in their work for just a moment before resuming their methodical organization of medical supplies. Awards and recognition were complications she'd learned to avoid, situations that required public attention and detailed scrutiny of credentials she'd prefer to keep private. I'm sure there are other nurses who would be more appropriate candidates, she said carefully. someone with more traditional qualifications or longer tenure in civilian emergency medicine. Margaret studied Rebecca's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades managing healthcare professionals. Rebecca, in 4 years of working here, you've never lost a critical patient during transport, never made a medication error, and never failed to anticipate complications before they became life-threatening. Dr. Harrison tells me that your clinical judgment is better than most physicians he's worked with. Dr. Harrison is generous with his praise, Rebecca deflected. But trauma care is a team effort. Individual recognition doesn't really reflect how emergency medicine actually works. That's exactly the kind of response I'd expect from you, Margaret said with a slight smile. Most nurses would be excited about professional recognition. You seem almost concerned about it. Rebecca finished organizing the supplies and faced Margaret directly, recognizing that she needed to end this conversation without creating suspicion about her reluctance to participate in professional recognition programs. Margaret, I appreciate your confidence in my work, but I'm not comfortable with award nominations. I prefer to focus on patient care rather than professional recognition. Surely there are other nurses who would benefit more from that kind of visibility. Margaret made a few notes on her clipboard, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with Rebecca's response. I'll respect your wishes, but I want you to know that your reluctance to accept recognition doesn't diminish the exceptional quality of your work. If you ever change your mind about professional development opportunities, please let me know. After Margaret left, Rebecca found herself alone in the pediatric treatment room, surrounded by cheerful decorations designed to distract young patients from medical procedures. She appreciated Margaret's recognition of her clinical skills, but awards and public attention were complications she couldn't afford. Her current life depended on maintaining a low profile, on being valued for her competence without attracting the kind of scrutiny that might reveal details about her previous career. The afternoon shift brought a series of routine cases that allowed Rebecca to work alongside Dr. Walsh on less critical patients. A construction worker with a dislocated shoulder, an elderly woman who'd fallen in her garden and needed stitches for a scalp laceration, and a teenager who'd managed to embed a fishhook in his thumb during a weekend camping trip. As they worked together, Rebecca noticed that Dr. Walsh had begun adapting to the rhythm of rural emergency medicine. The younger physician was learning to make quick assessments with limited resources, to communicate effectively with patients who might be suspicious of medical authority, and to coordinate care with specialists who were hours away rather than floors away. I have to admit, this is very different from my residency experience, Dr. Walsh said as they completed paperwork for the construction worker's discharge. At Johns Hopkins, we had immediate access to every specialist, every diagnostic tool, every treatment option. Here, we have to be much more self-reliant. Different doesn't necessarily mean worse, Rebecca replied. Rural medicine requires you to develop broader skills and better clinical judgment. You can't rely on consultants to make difficult decisions for you. Is that why you chose to work here? The challenge of independent practice. Rebecca paused in her charting, considering how to respond to Dr. Walsh's continued curiosity about her career choices. Over the past 3 weeks, the younger physician had asked several indirect questions about Rebecca's background, always professionally phrased but clearly motivated by genuine puzzlement about her unconventional career path. I chose Pine Ridge because it felt like home, Rebecca said simply. Sometimes you find a place where your skills are needed and your contributions are valued, and that becomes where you belong. Dr. Walsh seemed to recognize that Rebecca wasn't going to provide more detailed explanations, and she shifted the conversation to clinical topics. They spent the next hour discussing treatment protocols for common emergency presentations, with Rebecca sharing practical insights that supplemented Dr. Walsh's formal medical education. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff David Parker, a tall, Weathered man in his early 50s who'd been Pine Ridge County's senior law enforcement officer for nearly a decade. Sheriff Parker visited the hospital regularly, both for professional consultations about criminal cases involving injuries and for the more personal reason that his wife, Sandra, worked as a surgical technician in the hospital's operating room. Afternoon. "Rebecca, Dr. Walsh," Sheriff Parker said, removing his hat as he entered the emergency department. "I'm hoping you can help me with something unusual." Rebecca looked up from her paperwork with interest. Sheriff Parker's requests for medical consultation usually involved domestic violence cases, suspicious injuries that might indicate criminal activity, or traffic accidents where he needed professional opinions about the relationship between injuries and accident circumstances. "What can we do for you, Sheriff?" Dr. Walsh asked. "We've had reports of someone providing emergency medical care at accident scenes around the county, but disappearing before EMS arrives. 3 separate incidents in the past month where witnesses describe a woman who stopped to help injured people, provided what sounds like professional-level trauma care, then left the scene before paramedics could identify her." Rebecca continued her paperwork, but she was listening carefully to Sheriff Parker's description. Good Samaritan situations weren't uncommon in rural areas, where people often stopped to help accident victims, but professional-level trauma care suggested someone with significant medical training. "What kind of medical care are we talking about?" she asked. According to witnesses, this woman established 4 lines, performed what sounds like field amputations to free trapped victims, and provided advanced airway management. One witness described her using a pocket knife to perform an emergency tracheotomy on a man who was choking on blood after a motorcycle accident. Dr. Walsh whistled softly. "Those are advanced surgical procedures. Whoever this is, she has serious medical training." "That's what has me puzzled," Sheriff Parker continued. "We've contacted every hospital, clinic, and EM service within 100 miles, and nobody's missing any staff members. No one recognizes the description witnesses have provided." "What does she look like?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Asian woman, probably in her 30s, medium height, dark hair usually pulled back. Witnesses say she moves like someone with military training, very efficient and confident. Always wears civilian clothes, usually jeans and a jacket, but carries what appears to be a professional medical kit." Rebecca felt a familiar tension in her chest, the same alertness that had once warned her of potential threats in hostile territory. Someone with advanced medical training was providing emergency care at accident scenes and then disappearing, avoiding official contact with law enforcement or emergency services. It was exactly the kind of behavior she might expect from someone with a background similar to her own. Someone who possessed life-saving skills but couldn't afford official recognition or investigation. Have any of the people she helped been able to provide more detailed descriptions? Dr. Walsh asked. Most of them were too injured or traumatized to remember details clearly. But there was one interesting comment from a trucker who witnessed the motorcycle accident. He said the woman worked like she'd done it in a war zone, and that she kept checking the perimeter while she worked, as if she was watching for threats. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, but internally she was analyzing the implications of Sheriff Parker's report. If there was another person with combat medical experience operating in the area, it could complicate her own carefully maintained anonymity. More concerning was the possibility that this person might be someone she'd known during her military service, someone whose presence could expose secrets she wasn't prepared to reveal. "Are you concerned about legal liability issues?" she asked. Sheriff Parker. "Someone providing medical care without being licensed in Montana?" "Honestly, I'm more concerned about finding her and thanking her," Sheriff Parker replied. "According to the doctors who treated these accident victims, her emergency care probably saved at least 2 lives. But I'm also curious about why someone with that level of medical training would avoid contact with official emergency services." Dr. Walsh leaned forward with interest. What do you mean? Think about it from a law enforcement perspective. Most medical professionals want to ensure continuity of care when they provide emergency assistance. They stay at the scene, brief the paramedics, follow up to make sure their patients receive appropriate treatment. This woman provides excellent care and then vanishes. That suggests she has reasons for avoiding official attention. Rebecca understood Sheriff Parker's reasoning perfectly, because she'd spent 4 years developing her own strategies for avoiding exactly the kind of attention this mystery medic was attracting. The difference was that Rebecca had chosen to work within the official medical system, using her real identity and legitimate credentials, while simply avoiding discussions of her military background. The woman Sheriff Parker described seemed to be providing medical care while remaining completely outside official channels. Maybe she's just shy about recognition, Dr. Walsh suggested. Some people help others because it's the right thing to do, not because they want credit or thanks. Possible, Sheriff Parker agreed. But in my experience, people who avoid official contact usually have specific reasons. Could be immigration status, outstanding warrants, witness protection, military desertion, or any number of other situations where they can't afford to have their identity documented. Rebecca felt another surge of alertness. Sheriff Parker's casual mention of military desertion suggested he was considering the possibility that this mystery medic might have some connection to military service. If he began investigating that angle seriously, it could create complications for anyone in the area with undisclosed military backgrounds. Have you considered that she might just be someone who prefers privacy? Rebecca asked. Rural areas attract people who want to live quietly without a lot of official attention. Sheriff Parker studied Rebecca's face for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that his law enforcement instincts were analyzing her response. That's certainly possible. But someone with advanced trauma surgery skills isn't your typical reclusive mountain dweller. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an ambulance, its flashing lights visible through the emergency department windows. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh immediately shifted their attention to preparing for the incoming patient, while Sheriff Parker stepped aside to allow them to work. Pine Ridge Medical, this is County Innes Unit 4, the radio crackled. We're bringing you a 53-year-old male who fell approximately 20 feet from a construction scaffold. Patient has multiple injuries including probable head trauma, possible spinal fracture, and significant lacerations to both arms. ETA is 3 minutes. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh moved quickly to prepare Trauma Bay 1 for a high-priority case. As they worked, Rebecca found herself thinking about Sheriff Parker's description of the mystery medic who'd been providing emergency care at accident scenes. The behavioral patterns he described were consistent with someone who possessed advanced medical skills but couldn't afford official recognition or investigation. She understood that situation perfectly because she'd spent years developing her own approach to using her combat medical training while maintaining her carefully constructed civilian identity. The key was finding ways to help people without attracting attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about where and how she'd acquired her unusual expertise. The ambulance arrived with its characteristic urgency, and Rebecca focused her attention on the immediate demands of trauma care. But in the back of her mind, she remained curious about the identity of the mystery medic who was helping accident victims throughout Pine Ridge County. More importantly, she wondered whether this person's activities might eventually create complications for her own quiet life at the rural hospital. As they worked to stabilize the construction workers' injuries, Rebecca demonstrated the same calm efficiency that had impressed Dr. Walsh during her first week at Pine Ridge Medical. She anticipated Dr. Harrison's needs, coordinated with the hospital's imaging department, and managed multiple aspects of patient care simultaneously. But Dr. Walsh was beginning to notice subtle details about Rebecca's approach to trauma cases. That seemed inconsistent with civilian nursing experience. The way she assessed injury patterns, her knowledge of ballistic trauma despite Pine Ridge's limited exposure to gunshot wounds, and her automatic responses to high-stress situations all suggested training that went beyond traditional medical education. After they'd stabilized the patient and arranged for his transport to the regional trauma center, Dr. Walsh found an opportunity to continue their earlier conversation about the mystery medic. "Rebecca, what do you think about Sheriff Parker's theory that this woman might have military medical training?" Rebecca was cleaning and restocking their treatment area, her movements as methodical and efficient as always. "It's possible. Military medics receive excellent trauma training, and some of them transition to civilian careers after their service ends. But wouldn't someone with that background work in a hospital or with an AIM service? Why provide care at accident scenes and then disappear?" Rebecca paused in her work, considering how to respond without revealing her own understanding of the situation. "Military service can be complicated, Dr. Walsh. People leave the armed forces for various reasons, and not all of them want to discuss their experiences or use their military credentials in civilian careers. Are you speaking from personal experience?" The question was asked gently, without accusation or pressure, but Rebecca recognized that Dr. Walsh was directly asking about her own military background. She'd managed to deflect similar inquiries for 4 years, but Dr. Walsh was intelligent, observant, and genuinely curious about her colleague's unusual expertise. "I'm speaking from an understanding that people have complex reasons for their career choices," Rebecca replied diplomatically. "Sometimes the most qualified people are the ones who prefer to work quietly, without a lot of attention or recognition." Dr. Walsh seemed to accept this response, but Rebecca could see that her curiosity remained unsatisfied. The younger physician had clearly noticed the inconsistencies between Rebecca's official credentials and her demonstrated expertise, and she was intelligent enough to suspect that there were significant details about Rebecca's background that hadn't been disclosed. As the afternoon shift concluded, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the challenges of maintaining her carefully constructed civilian identity. For 4 years, she'd successfully integrated her military medical training into her work at Pine Ridge Medical without attracting unwanted attention or questions. But the arrival of Dr. Walsh had introduced a new variable into her carefully balanced life. The younger physician was observant, professionally curious, and genuinely interested in understanding her colleagues' backgrounds and expertise. Unlike other staff members who'd accepted Rebecca's deflections about her past, Dr. Walsh seemed determined to understand the source of her unusual clinical skills. More concerning was Sheriff Parker's investigation of the mystery medic who was providing emergency care at accident scenes throughout the county. If he began seriously investigating the possibility of military medical personnel operating in the area, it could create complications for anyone with undisclosed combat medical experience. Rebecca gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the hospital, but her mind remained focused on the potential threats to her carefully maintained anonymity. She'd spent years developing strategies for using her military medical training while avoiding questions about her past, but recent events suggested that her quiet life in rural Montana might be becoming more complicated than she'd anticipated. Emergency call came at 2:34 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late September, 3 months after Sheriff Parker's first mention of the mystery medic. Rebecca had been working the overnight shift when the distinctive wail of emergency sirens echoed across Pine Ridge County, followed immediately by the hospital's trauma alert system. She was in the supply room cataloging inventory when her pager buzzed with an urgent message. "Multiple casualties. Explosion at Copper Mountain Mining Facility. All available personnel report to Ed immediately." Rebecca moved quickly through the hospital corridors, her mind automatically shifting into the Kojin's heightened awareness state that had once been essential for survival in combat zones. Multiple casualty incidents required careful coordination, resource management, and the ability to make rapid triage decisions that would determine who lived and who died. The emergency department was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Dr. Harrison was coordinating with the hospital administrator about opening additional treatment areas, while Dr. Walsh was checking the equipment in both trauma bays. The night supervisor, Linda Crawford, was making calls to bring in off-duty personnel. "What do we know about the situation?" Rebecca asked Dr. Harrison as she began preparing for mass casualty protocols. Explosion at the mining facility around 2:15 a.m. Initial reports suggest some kind of equipment malfunction in the main processing building. At least 8 workers were on the night shift, and emergency responders can't account for all of them yet. Rebecca nodded, her mind already calculating the resources they would need for treating blast injuries, potential chemical exposures, and trauma cases complicated by industrial accident scenarios. Mining explosions created complex injury patterns that challenged even experienced trauma teams. "Are we expecting chemical contamination?" she asked, pulling protective equipment from storage cabinets. "Unknown at this point. Fire department is setting up decontamination protocols at the scene, but we should be prepared for patients who've been exposed to mining chemicals or processing compounds." The first ambulance arrived at 2:47 a.m. carrying 2 miners who'd been outside the main building when the explosion occurred. Both had sustained flash burns and hearing damage from the blast, but their injuries were relatively minor compared to what Rebecca expected from the workers who'd been inside the facility. As she and Dr. Walsh worked to treat the burn victims, Rebecca found herself drawing on knowledge she'd gained treating blast injuries in Afghanistan. The pattern of burns, the specific areas of tissue damage, and the combination of thermal and pressure injuries were grimly familiar from her combat medical experience. "Rebecca, how should we position this patient for optimal airway management?" Dr. Walsh asked as they treated a miner whose face had been burned by superheated gases from the explosion. Rebecca adjusted the patient's head and neck alignment with practiced precision, using techniques that optimized breathing while protecting potentially damaged cervical vertebrae. "Keep his chin elevated, but avoid hyperextension. The thermal damage to his airway means we need to be prepared for rapid swelling that could compromise his breathing." Dr. Walsh followed Rebecca's guidance, but she was clearly puzzled by the specificity of her recommendations. "That's not standard burn protocol. Where did you learn that positioning technique?" "Experience with thermal injuries," Rebecca replied. "Simply continuing to monitor the patient's vital signs while preparing medication for pain management." Their work was interrupted by the arrival of 3 more ambulances, carrying victims with much more severe injuries. Rebecca quickly assessed the incoming patients, making rapid triage decisions that would determine the order of treatment and allocation of medical resources. The most critically injured was a man in his 40s, who'd been trapped in the main processing building when the explosion occurred. He had extensive burns covering 40% of his body, multiple fractures from falling debris, and signs of severe smoke inhalation. Rebecca took one look at his condition and knew he would require immediate transport to the regional burn center if he was going to survive. "Dr. Harrison, this patient needs helicopter transport to Denver General immediately," she said without preamble. "His burn percentage and smoke inhalation are beyond our treatment capabilities." Dr. Harrison examined the patient quickly and nodded agreement. "Call for medical helicopter transport." "Rebecca, can you coordinate his care until the flight crew arrives?" As she worked to stabilize the critically burned miner, Rebecca found herself relying heavily on techniques she'd learned treating soldiers injured by improvised explosive devices. The combination of thermal burns, blast trauma, and inhalation injuries required specialized knowledge that wasn't commonly needed in rural emergency medicine. Dr. Walsh observed Rebecca's treatment approach with growing amazement. The senior Nurse was performing advanced burn care procedures, managing complex 4 medications, and coordinating multiple aspects of critical care simultaneously. Her clinical decision-making was precise and confident, suggesting extensive experience with exactly these types of injuries. "Rebecca, that's the second time tonight you've known specific protocols for blast injuries," Dr. Walsh said quietly as they prepared the patient for helicopter transport. "Those aren't common presentations in rural Montana." Rebecca continued her work without responding immediately, but she was acutely aware that her combat medical experience was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. The mining explosion had created injury patterns that were virtually identical to what she'd treated in Afghanistan, and her automatic responses were drawing from knowledge she'd hoped never to use again. The medical helicopter arrived at 3:28 a.m., and Rebecca briefed the flight crew on the patient's condition and treatment requirements. As the aircraft lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, she found herself remembering other helicopter evacuations in much more dangerous circumstances, where enemy fire and hostile territory made medical transport a life-threatening gamble. "That was incredible work," Dr. Walsh said as they watched the helicopter disappear into the night sky. "You managed that burn case like you've treated hundreds of similar injuries." Rebecca was cleaning and restocking their treatment area, her movements automatic and efficient. "Burn cases require careful attention to fluid management and airway protection. The principles are the same regardless of the cause. But you knew specific techniques for blast-related thermal injuries. That's very specialized knowledge, even for emergency nurses with extensive trauma experience." Before Rebecca could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Parker, who appeared at the emergency department entrance, still wearing the protective gear he'd used at the mining facility. His face was grim, and Rebecca could see that he was carrying information that would complicate an already difficult situation. "Dr. Harrison, we've got a problem at the mining site," Sheriff Parker announced. "The explosion wasn't caused by equipment malfunction. It was deliberate." The emergency department fell silent as the implications of Sheriff Parker's statement registered with the medical staff. An industrial accident was one thing, but a deliberate explosion suggested criminal activity that could have far-reaching consequences for the community. "Are you saying this was sabotage?" Dr. Harrison asked. "That's exactly what I'm saying. Arson." Investigators found evidence of explosive devices placed strategically throughout the processing building. This wasn't an accident, it was an attack. Rebecca felt a familiar cold alertness spreading through her nervous system, the same heightened awareness that had once warned her of ambushes and hostile activity in combat zones. Deliberate explosions in civilian areas suggested the kind of threats she'd hoped never to encounter again after leaving military service. "Do you have any suspects?" Dr. Walsh asked. Sheriff Parker removed his protective helmet and ran a hand through his graying hair. "We're investigating several possibilities. The mining company has been dealing with labor disputes, environmental protests, and some threats from anti-government extremists who oppose industrial development in the area." Rebecca continued her work, but her mind was analyzing the tactical implications of Sheriff Parker's information. Coordinated explosive attacks on industrial facilities required planning, expertise, and resources that suggested organized criminal activity rather than random violence. "Sheriff, do you think there's a threat of additional attacks?" she asked, trying to keep her voice professionally neutral. "That's our biggest concern right now. If this was the work of an organized group, they might target other facilities in the county. We're coordinating with federal agencies to assess the threat level and provide additional security for critical infrastructure." The mention of federal agencies triggered another wave of alertness in Rebecca's consciousness. FBI and ATF involvement would bring sophisticated investigative resources to Pine Ridge County, including background checks, security screenings, and the kind of detailed scrutiny that could expose information she preferred to keep private. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of two more ambulances carrying the remaining victims from the mining explosion. Rebecca and Dr. Walsh returned to treating injured miners, but the knowledge that they were dealing with victims of a deliberate attack added a layer of tension to their medical work. As the night progressed, Rebecca found herself thinking about the broader implications of the mining facility attack. If extremist groups were operating in Pine Ridge County, it could create exactly the kind of dangerous environment that might require her to use skills she'd hoped never to need again. More immediately concerning was the possibility that federal investigators would conduct thorough background checks on anyone who demonstrated unusual expertise in dealing with the aftermath of the explosion. Her performance tonight had been exceptional, but it had also been conspicuous in ways that might attract unwanted attention. By dawn, they'd treated 7 injured miners, coordinated 3 helicopter transports to regional trauma centers, and managed the most complex mass casualty incident in Pine Ridge Medical Center's recent history. Rebecca had performed flawlessly throughout the crisis, but she was aware that her expertise had been noticed by colleagues who were already curious about her unconventional background. As the day shift arrived and began taking over patient care responsibilities, Dr. Walsh approached Rebecca with obvious admiration and persistent curiosity. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something directly," Dr. Walsh said as they completed their shift documentation. "Your performance tonight was extraordinary. You handled blast injuries, chemical exposures, and mass casualty triage like you've been doing it for decades. That level of expertise doesn't come from civilian nursing experience." Rebecca looked up from her paperwork, recognizing that Dr. Walsh's question couldn't be deflected with her usual diplomatic responses. The younger physician had observed too much, noticed too many inconsistencies, and deserved a more honest answer than Rebecca had been providing. "Dr. Walsh, I've had training that goes beyond civilian nursing education," she said carefully. "But the specific details of that training aren't something I discuss in professional settings." "Military training?" Rebecca held Dr. Walsh's gaze steadily, acknowledging the question without providing confirmation. "Some experiences are difficult to talk about, even years later. What matters is using whatever skills you have to help people who need medical care." Dr. Walsh nodded slowly, clearly understanding that Rebecca was confirming her suspicions without explicitly discussing her military background. "I respect your privacy, Rebecca, but I want you to know that whatever training gave you those skills, I'm grateful that Pine Ridge Medical has the benefit of your expertise." As Rebecca prepared to leave the hospital after her extended shift, she reflected on how dramatically the night had changed her situation. The mining explosion had required her to demonstrate capabilities that were clearly inconsistent with civilian nursing experience, and federal investigators would soon be examining everyone connected to the incident. More concerning was the possibility that the attack represented the beginning of a pattern of extremist violence in Pine Ridge County. If additional incidents occurred, she might be forced to use combat skills she'd hoped never to need again, which would make concealing her military background impossible. She drove home through the early morning light, passing the smoking remains of the Copper Mountain mining facility in the distance. The industrial complex that had employed dozens of local residents was now a crime scene surrounded by federal investigators, and the peaceful rural community where she'd found sanctuary was transforming into something more dangerous and unpredictable. That afternoon, Rebecca was awakened by a phone call from Margaret Thompson, asking her to return to the hospital for a meeting with federal investigators, who wanted to interview all personnel who'd treated victims of the mining explosion. The request was presented as routine information gathering, but Rebecca understood that it represented exactly the kind of official scrutiny she'd spent 4 years trying to avoid. As she prepared to return to Pine Ridge Medical for the federal interview, Rebecca Chun realized that her carefully constructed civilian life was beginning to unravel. The mining explosion had forced her to demonstrate expertise that couldn't be explained by civilian nursing training. And now federal investigators would be examining her background with the thoroughness that came with national security investigations. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, seeing the same face that had stared back at her for 4 years of quiet service at the rural hospital. But behind her eyes was the growing awareness that her past was catching up with her present, and the peaceful life she'd built in Montana might be ending sooner than she'd ever anticipated. The woman who'd once carried a concealed rifle in her medical stretcher was about to discover whether her secrets could survive federal investigation. And in the distance, the smoke from the destroyed mining facility reminded her that some threats were too dangerous to face with medical skills alone. Agent Sarah Collins from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at Pine Ridge Medical Center exactly 48 hours after the mining facility explosion. She was a woman in her early 40s with steel-gray eyes and the kind of quiet intensity that Rebecca recognized from her own military service. Agent Collins carried herself with the controlled alertness of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, and her questions would be far more sophisticated than anything Rebecca had faced during her 4 years of civilian life. The interview was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the hospital's small conference room, a space normally used for medical staff meetings that felt increasingly cramped as Agent Collins arranged her digital recorder, laptop computer, and manila folders containing background information on every hospital employee who'd participated in treating the explosion victims. Rebecca arrived precisely on time, wearing her standard civilian clothes and carrying the same professional demeanor she'd maintained throughout her nursing career. But internally, she was preparing for the most dangerous conversation she'd had since leaving military service, one that could expose secrets she'd spent years protecting. "Ms. Chun, thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Agent Collins began, her voice professionally neutral, but carrying undertones of authority that suggested extensive experience with criminal investigations. "I understand you played a significant role in treating victims of the Copper Mountain incident." "I was working the overnight shift when the casualties arrived," Rebecca replied carefully. "All of our emergency department staff worked together to provide the best possible care under difficult circumstances." Agent Collins consulted her notes, flipping through pages that contained information Rebecca couldn't see but suspected included details about her performance during the mass casualty event. "According to Dr. Harrison and Dr. Walsh, your expertise with blast injuries was exceptional. Dr. Walsh specifically mentioned that you demonstrated knowledge of specialized treatment protocols that aren't commonly taught in civilian nursing programs." Rebecca felt the familiar tension that preceded dangerous territory in conversation, the same alertness that had once warned her of potential ambush during reconnaissance missions. Emergency medicine requires adapting to unusual situations. When people are injured, you use whatever knowledge and skills you have available to help them. "Where did you acquire your knowledge of blast injury treatment?" The question was asked without accusation or pressure, but Rebecca understood that Agent Collins was probing for information that could reveal her military background. She'd prepared for this moment during the drive to the hospital, considering various approaches to answering questions about her specialized medical expertise. "I've had additional training beyond my basic nursing education," she said, maintaining eye contact with Agent Collins while providing the minimum amount of information necessary to answer the question. "What kind of additional training?" Rebecca paused, recognizing that she was approaching a decision point that would determine whether her carefully constructed civilian identity could survive federal investigation. Agent Collins wasn't making casual inquiries about professional development. She was conducting a systematic examination designed to uncover inconsistencies and hidden information. "Military medical training," Rebecca admitted, knowing that attempting to conceal her service record from federal investigators would be both futile and potentially incriminating. Agent Collins made a note in her folder, but her expression didn't change. "Which branch of service?" "United States Army Medical Corps." Dates of service? 2010 to 2018. Agent Collins continued writing, and Rebecca could see that she was filling in gaps in background information that the FBI had already begun collecting. The investigation into the mining facility explosion would include thorough vetting of everyone who demonstrated unusual capabilities in responding to the incident. What was your military specialty? Rebecca hesitated again, knowing that her next answer would provide Agent Collins with specific information about training that could explain her exceptional performance treating blast injuries. 6-8W combat medic with additional training in tactical field surgery. Deployed assignments? 2. Tours in Afghanistan, medical support for forward operating bases in Helmand and Kandahar provinces. Agent Collins looked up from her notes for the first time since beginning her questioning, studying Rebecca's face with the analytical attention of someone trained to detect deception and evaluate credibility. Ms. Chun, combat medics with field surgery training are highly specialized personnel. Why didn't you mention your military background when you applied for employment at Pine Ridge Medical? It wasn't relevant to civilian nursing, Rebecca replied, though she knew the answer sounded weak even as she spoke it. Extensive trauma surgery experience isn't relevant to emergency nursing? Rebecca recognized that Agent Collins had identified the inconsistency in her explanation, the obvious contradiction between possessing advanced combat medical skills and claiming they weren't relevant to civilian emergency medicine. She needed a better explanation, one that addressed Agent Collins' skepticism without revealing the deeper reasons for her secrecy. Agent Collins, transitioning from military to civilian life can be complicated, she said, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes veterans prefer to focus on their current roles, rather than discussing experiences that might be difficult for civilian colleagues to understand. Agent Collins nodded slightly, suggesting she'd encountered similar explanations from other veterans who were reluctant to discuss their military service. Did you receive any commendations or special recognition during your military service? The question struck directly at information Rebecca had hoped to avoid discussing. Her military record included decorations that would reveal the extent of her combat experience and the dangerous nature of her assignments, details that could complicate her civilian life in ways she wasn't prepared to handle. I received standard recognition for medical service in combat zones, she said, hoping to satisfy Agent Collins' inquiry without providing specific details. Ms. Chun, I'm going to be direct with you, Agent Collins said, closing her folder and fixing Rebecca with a steady gaze. The FBI's preliminary investigation has uncovered evidence suggesting that the mining facility explosion may be connected to a larger pattern of domestic terrorism targeting infrastructure in several Western states. We're conducting thorough background checks on everyone who demonstrated unusual expertise in responding to the incident, because we need to understand whether there are connections between the attack and individuals with specialized military or technical training. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Agent Collins' statement. The mining explosion wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of domestic terrorism, which meant the federal investigation would be extensive, sophisticated, and focused on identifying anyone with capabilities that might be relevant to national security concerns. Are you suggesting that hospital personnel might be connected to the attack? She asked. I'm suggesting that we need to verify the backgrounds and motivations of everyone who had access to information about the explosion's aftermath, Agent Collins replied. Your military record indicates you have experience with explosive devices, trauma surgery, and operations in hostile environments. That combination of skills is relevant to our investigation. Rebecca understood that Agent Collins was informing her that she'd become a person of interest in a federal terrorism investigation, not because of any suspicious behavior, but because her background included capabilities that were relevant to the crimes being investigated. It was exactly the kind of official attention she'd spent 4 years trying to avoid. "Agent Collins, I need to be clear about something," Rebecca said, deciding that complete honesty was her best strategy for managing this dangerous situation. "I left military service because I wanted a quieter life focused on helping people. In civilian medical settings, I've never had any involvement with anti-government groups, domestic terrorism, or any activities that would compromise national security. I appreciate your directness, Ms. Chun, but I'm sure you understand that we need to verify those statements through thorough investigation of your activities since leaving military service." Agent Collins reopened her folder and consulted additional documents that Rebecca couldn't see. "Our preliminary research indicates that after your discharge from the Army in 2018, you moved directly to Pine Ridge County and began working at this hospital. That's an unusual career path for someone with your level of military medical training. Most combat medics with field surgery experience pursue positions at major trauma centers or continue their military careers." Rebecca had anticipated this question and prepared an explanation that was both truthful and designed to deflect deeper inquiry into her personal motivations. "Agent Collins, combat medical service can be emotionally demanding. After 8 years of treating soldiers injured in hostile environments, I wanted to use my skills in a setting where I could help people without the stress and danger of military operations. Did you have any contact with anti-government or extremist groups during your transition to civilian life?" "None whatsoever." "Have you observed any suspicious activities in Pine Ridge County that might be related to the mining facility attack?" Rebecca considered mentioning Sheriff Parker's reports about the mystery medic who'd been providing emergency care at accident scenes, but decided that introducing additional unexplained variables into the investigation might complicate her situation, rather than clarifying it. "Nothing that seemed unusual for a rural community," she replied. Agent Collins made additional notes, then looked up at Rebecca with an expression that suggested the formal questioning portion of their interview was concluding. "Ms. Chun, I want to thank you for your cooperation and your service to our country. The FBI appreciates the medical care you provided to victims of the mining facility attack, and we understand that your military training contributed significantly to saving lives during a difficult situation." Rebecca felt some of the tension leaving her shoulders, recognizing that Agent Collins' tone had shifted from investigative questioning to professional acknowledgement. But she also understood that the federal investigation was far from over, and her background would continue to be scrutinized as long as the terrorism case remained active. "However," Agent Collins continued, "I need to inform you that your background and demonstrated capabilities mean that you may be contacted again as our investigation progresses. We may also need to verify aspects of your military service record and your activities since moving to Pine Ridge County." Rebecca nodded, understanding that she was being warned that federal investigators would be examining her life with the thoroughness that accompanied national security investigations. Her carefully maintained anonymity was ending, and the quiet civilian existence she'd built in rural Montana was about to become much more complicated. As Agent Collins packed up her materials and prepared to leave, Rebecca found herself thinking about the broader implications of their conversation. The mining facility explosion had forced her to demonstrate combat medical skills that couldn't be concealed, and now those same skills had made her a person of interest in a federal terrorism investigation. More concerning was Agent Collins' mention of a broader pattern of domestic terrorism targeting infrastructure in western states. If extremist groups were operating throughout the region, Pine Ridge County might face additional attacks that would require exactly the kind of skills Rebecca possessed but had hoped never to use again. After Agent Collins left, Rebecca sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, processing the reality that her secret military background was no longer secret. By tomorrow, hospital administrators and her medical colleagues would know that she was a decorated combat veteran with specialized training in tactical field surgery. Information that would fundamentally change how they perceived her role at Pine Ridge Medical Center. She walked slowly back to the emergency department, where Dr. Walsh was reviewing patient charts at the nursing station. The younger physician looked up as Rebecca approached, and her expression suggested she'd been waiting for an opportunity to discuss the federal interview. "How did it go with Agent Collins?" Dr. Walsh asked quietly. Rebecca considered her response carefully, knowing that her answer would set the tone for how her colleagues would react to learning about her military background. She was professional and thorough. "The FBI is investigating everyone who helped treat the explosion victims." "Did you tell her about your military service?" Rebecca met Dr. Walsh's gaze directly, recognizing that there was no longer any point in maintaining the careful ambiguity she'd used for 4 years. "Yes, she needed to understand where I learned to treat blast injuries." Dr. Walsh nodded slowly, and Rebecca could see that her confirmation answered questions the younger physician had been asking herself since their first day working together. "Rebecca, I want you to know that learning about your military background doesn't change my respect for your work here. If anything, it helps me understand why you're such an exceptional emergency nurse." As Rebecca returned to her normal duties in the emergency department, she reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in the space of a single interview. Her military service was no longer hidden. Federal investigators would be examining her background with systematic thoroughness, and the peaceful anonymity she'd maintained for 4 years was coming to an end. But more immediately concerning was the possibility that the domestic terrorism investigation would reveal threats to Pine Ridge County that might require her to use capabilities she'd hoped never to need again. The woman who'd once hidden a rifle in her medical stretcher might soon discover that her combat skills were still necessary, even in the quiet rural community where she'd sought refuge from her military past. 3 days after Agent Collins' interview, Rebecca Chun arrived at Pine Ridge Medical Center to find the hospital's parking lot filled with unfamiliar vehicles. Black SUVs with government plates, a mobile command unit from the FBI, and news vans from regional television stations had transformed the normally quiet medical facility into the center of what appeared to be a major federal operation. She parked her Honda Civic in the employee section, noting the increased security presence and the way federal agents were monitoring everyone who entered or left the building. Whatever developments had occurred overnight, they had elevated the mining facility investigation to a level that required significant federal resources and media attention. Dr. Harrison met her at the staff entrance, his expression grim and his usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious stress. "Rebecca, I need to brief you before you interact with anyone else this morning. The situation has changed dramatically since yesterday." They walked quickly toward his office, passing federal agents who were setting up equipment in areas of the hospital that were normally restricted to medical personnel. Rebecca could see that Pine Ridge Medical Center had effectively been transformed into a temporary command post for what appeared to be a major law enforcement operation. "What's happened?" she asked as Dr. Harrison closed his office door and activated the white noise generator he normally used during confidential personnel discussions. "Early this morning, federal agents arrested 5 members of a domestic terrorist cell operating throughout Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. The group was responsible for the mining facility explosion and at least 6 other attacks on infrastructure targets over the past 18 months. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Dr. Harrison's information. A coordinated domestic terrorism network with capabilities to attack multiple infrastructure targets represented exactly the kind of sophisticated threat that might require responses beyond civilian law enforcement capabilities. "Do they have all the members in custody?" she asked, automatically thinking about operational security and the possibility that additional cells might be operating in the region. Dr. Harrison studied her face with the same analytical attention she'd noticed From Agent Collins during the federal interview. Rebecca, that's exactly the kind of question I'd expect from someone with your background. And it's why I need to discuss something important with you. He opened a folder on his desk and withdrew several documents that Rebecca could see, including official letterhead from the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. Her stomach tightened as she recognized that federal agencies had been examining her military records with the thoroughness that accompanied national security investigations. Agent Collins returned yesterday with additional information about your service record, Dr. Harrison continued. Rebecca, you weren't just a combat medic. You were attached to special operations units, conducting classified missions in Afghanistan. Your military decorations include the Bronze Star with Valor, the Combat Medical Badge, and commendations for service under hostile fire. Rebecca remained silent, understanding that Dr. Harrison was confronting her with information that revealed the extent of her combat experience and the dangerous nature of her military assignments. Her carefully constructed identity as a rural emergency nurse was being replaced by the reality of her background as a highly trained special operations medic. More significantly, Dr. Harrison said, consulting another document, your discharge wasn't routine rotation back to civilian life. You were medically retired after being wounded during a classified operation involving the rescue of American personnel from a terrorist compound. Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied discussions of her final military mission, the operation that had ended her combat career and led to her decision to seek anonymity in civilian medical practice. It was information she'd hoped never to discuss with her civilian colleagues, details that belonged to a different life and a different identity. Dr. Harrison, my military service ended several years ago, she said carefully. What matters now is my work here at Pine Ridge Medical. Rebecca, I'm not questioning your commitment to civilian medicine, Dr. Harrison replied. But Agent Collins has requested that you serve as a consultant to the federal task force investigating domestic terrorism in this region. Your combination of medical expertise and special operations experience makes you uniquely qualified to assess threats and coordinate responses to potential attacks. The request struck Rebecca like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that her specialized military training might still be needed despite her years of quiet service in rural Montana. She'd joined the hospital staff specifically to escape the dangerous, high-stakes environment of special operations medicine, but circumstances were pulling her back toward exactly the kind of work she'd hoped to leave behind. I'm a civilian nurse, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they sounded hollow given what Dr. Harrison had just revealed about her background. You're a decorated special operations medic with classified clearances and experience in counterterrorism operations, Dr. Harrison corrected gently. And right now, that expertise might be essential for protecting this community. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Dr. Harrison called for entry, and Agent Collins stepped into the room carrying additional folders and wearing the expression of someone who'd been working without sleep for extended periods. Miss Chun, I'm glad you're here, Agent Collins said without preamble. We have a developing situation that requires your immediate consultation. Rebecca looked between Dr. Harrison and Agent Collins, understanding that her carefully maintained civilian life was ending, and that she was being drawn back into the world of classified operations and national security threats that she'd hoped to leave permanently behind. What kind of situation? She asked, though she suspected the answer would involve exactly the kind of dangerous circumstances that had originally led her to seek anonymity in rural medicine. Agent Collins opened one of her folders and withdrew surveillance photographs that showed individuals Rebecca didn't recognize engaged in activities that appeared to involve reconnaissance of civilian infrastructure targets. Our investigation has identified a second terrorist cell operating in this region, and we have intelligence suggesting they're planning an attack significantly larger than the mining facility explosion. Rebecca studied the photographs with the analytical attention that had once been essential for mission planning in hostile territories. The individuals appeared to be conducting systematic surveillance of targets that included power transmission facilities, water treatment plants, and transportation infrastructure. "What's the timeline for their planned attack?" she asked, automatically shifting into the operational mindset that had characterized her military service. "Unknown, but intelligence suggests it could occur within the next 72 hours. Agent Collins replied, "Ms. Chun, we need someone with your background to assess their capabilities and help coordinate a response that protects civilian populations, while allowing us to intercept the terrorist cell." Rebecca felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded dangerous missions, the heightened awareness and mental clarity that came with high-stakes operational planning. Despite her years of civilian medical practice, her combat training remained sharp and her ability to function under extreme pressure was unchanged. "Agent Collins, I left Special Operations because I wanted to serve people without the stress and danger of military missions," she said, though she could hear the lack of conviction in her own voice. "I understand your preference for civilian service," Agent Collins replied. "But right now, you may be the only person in this region with the specialized training necessary to prevent a terrorist attack that could kill dozens of innocent people." Dr. Harrison leaned forward from behind his desk. "Rebecca, no one is ordering you to participate in this operation. But Agent Collins is right about your unique qualifications, and this community has become your home over the past 4 years." Rebecca looked through the office window at the hospital parking lot, where she could see federal agents coordinating what appeared to be preparations for a major law enforcement operation. Pine Ridge Medical Center, the place where she'd found peace and purpose after leaving military service, was now the center of exactly the kind of dangerous situation she'd hoped never to face again. "What would you need me to do?" she asked Agent Collins, recognizing that she was crossing a threshold from civilian nurse back to special operations medic. "Initially, assess the terrorist cell's capabilities based on intelligence we've gathered. Then serve as medical support for the federal task force during the interdiction operation. Your combat medical training could be essential if agents are wounded during the arrest operation." Rebecca understood that Agent Collins was asking her to resume her role as a special operations medic, to apply the same skills she'd used treating wounded soldiers in Afghanistan to protecting federal agents during a domestic counter-terrorism mission. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes medical support that had defined her military career. "Will I have access to appropriate medical equipment and supplies?" she asked, her mind already shifting toward operational planning. Agent Collins smiled. For the first time since Rebecca had met her, "We've brought military-grade medical equipment from the Federal Task Force Medical Unit. You'd be working with resources comparable to what you used during your special operations deployments." Dr. Harrison was observing their conversation with obvious amazement as he watched Rebecca's transformation from rural emergency nurse to special operations planning mode. "Rebecca, if you decide to assist the Federal Task Force, Pine Ridge Medical will continue your employment and provide whatever support you need." Rebecca stood and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Pine Ridge County. For 4 years, those peaks had represented peace and safety, a refuge from the dangerous world of special operations and combat medicine. But now they might conceal terrorist cells planning attacks on the community she'd come to consider home. "Agent Collins, I need to understand something," she said without turning from the window. "Is this a one-time consultation, or are you asking me to permanently return to special operations work?" "For now, we only need your assistance with this specific threat," Agent Collins replied. "But I won't lie to you, your combination of medical expertise and special operations experience makes you extremely valuable for domestic counter-terrorism operations." There would likely be additional requests for your services. Rebecca turned back to face Agent Collins and Dr. Harrison, recognizing that she was making a decision that would fundamentally alter the quiet civilian life she'd built in rural Montana. But she also understood that her specialized training might be essential for protecting innocent people from terrorist attacks. "I'll help you," she said simply. "But I have conditions," Agent Collins nodded. "What conditions?" "My primary responsibility remains to my patients at Pine Ridge Medical. Any federal consultation work has to be coordinated around my civilian medical duties. And I want to maintain my employment here regardless of what other responsibilities you might request." "Agreed," Agent Collins said immediately. "Ms. Chin, I need to brief you on the current threat assessment and operational plans. Can you be ready to deploy within 6 hours?" Rebecca felt the familiar mental shift that had once prepared her for dangerous missions, the focused clarity that came with accepting high-stakes responsibilities. "I can be ready in 2 hours. But first, I need to retrieve some equipment from my personal storage." Dr. Harrison looked puzzled. "What kind of equipment?" Rebecca met his gaze directly, acknowledging that her carefully maintained civilian identity was ending and that her colleagues were about to learn exactly who she'd been before arriving in Pine Ridge County. "My tactical medical kit," she said. "The one I use during special operations deployments. Some tools are too specialized to replace with civilian medical equipment." As she prepared to leave Dr. Harrison's office and resume her role as a special operations medic, Rebecca Chun realized that her years of quiet service in rural Montana had been an interlude rather than a permanent career change. The woman who'd once hidden a rifle in her medical stretcher was returning to active duty, and Pine Ridge County was about to discover that their unassuming emergency nurse had capabilities that went far beyond civilian medical practice. 6 months after the Tazhasa terrorist operation, Rebecca Chun stood before a packed auditorium at the Montana Emergency Medical Services Conference, facing an audience of paramedics, nurses, and emergency physicians who'd gathered to hear her speak about crisis medicine and community service. The invitation had surprised her, but Dr. Harrison had insisted that her unique perspective could benefit emergency medical professionals throughout the region. "When I moved to Pine Ridge 4 years ago, I thought I was leaving my military career behind forever," she began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system. "What I discovered is that service doesn't end when you change uniforms. It just takes different forms." In the audience, she could see familiar faces from Pine Ridge Medical Center. Dr. Walsh sat in the front row, beaming with pride at her colleagues. Recognition. Margaret Thompson, the head of nursing, had brought several staff members to hear Rebecca's presentation. Even Sheriff Parker was present, representing the law enforcement perspective on emergency medical coordination. Rural emergency medicine teaches you that resources are always limited. Backup is always far away, and the person standing next to you might be the only help available when someone's life hangs in the balance. Rebecca continued, "Those constraints force you to develop capabilities you never knew you possessed." She clicked to her next slide, showing images of Pine Ridge Medical Center's emergency department during the mining facility incident. 6 months ago, our community faced a crisis that tested everything we thought we knew about emergency response. But what we discovered wasn't that we were unprepared. It was that preparation takes many forms. And sometimes the most valuable resources are the people who've been quietly serving among us all along. After her presentation, Rebecca was approached by dozens of conference attendees who wanted to discuss tactical medicine, crisis coordination, and the integration of military medical training into civilian practice. Many were veterans themselves, people who'd struggled with similar challenges in transitioning specialized military skills to civilian emergency medicine. "Captain Chun, I served as a Navy corpsman in Iraq," said a young paramedic from Billings. "I've always felt like my combat medical training was somehow separate from my civilian EMS work. How did you learn to integrate those experiences?" Rebecca considered the question carefully, remembering her own years of maintaining artificial separation between her military background and civilian nursing career. The key isn't integration, it's recognition that they were never really separate. The commitment to saving lives, the willingness to risk personal safety for others, the ability to function under extreme pressure, those qualities don't change based on your uniform or employment setting. That evening, Rebecca returned to Pine Ridge to find the hospital staff break room decorated with congratulations banners and a small celebration cake. Her colleagues had organized an impromptu party to recognize her speaking engagement and the positive attention it brought to their rural medical facility. "Speech! Speech!" called out Jake Rodriguez, one of the maintenance staff who'd become her friend during her years of quiet service. Rebecca laughed and shook her head. "I think I've done enough public speaking for one day." "Come on, Rebecca," Dr. Walsh insisted. "Just a few words for the people who've worked beside you all these years." Rebecca looked around the break room at faces she'd come to know and respect during her time at Pine Ridge Medical. These were people who'd accepted her transformation from mysterious farm worker to decorated combat veteran with grace and continued friendship. "When I first arrived here, I thought the most important thing was blending in, avoiding attention, being useful without being conspicuous," she said. "But this community taught me that hiding your capabilities doesn't protect anyone. Real service means being ready to use whatever skills you have when people need help." She paused, meeting the eyes of colleagues who'd witnessed her journey from secretive anonymity to open integration of her military and medical identities. "Thank you for accepting all of who I am, not just the parts I was comfortable sharing." Later that night, Rebecca sat on her ranch house porch, looking out over the valley where she'd found both refuge and purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Collins. "Interested in consulting contract for rural tactical medicine training. Interested?" Rebecca smiled and typed her response. "Send details. But Pine Ridge Medical remains my primary commitment." The offer didn't surprise her. Since the terrorist operation, she'd received inquiries from various federal agencies and military organizations, seeking consultants with her unique combination of combat experience and civilian medical practice. She'd accepted some projects that allowed her to contribute to national security while maintaining her life in Montana. Her front door opened, and Dr. Walsh stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. Their friendship had deepened considerably since the night Jennifer had witnessed Rebecca's complete transformation from nurse to special operations sniper. "Penny for your thoughts," Dr. Walsh said, settling into the adjacent chair. "Just thinking about how much has changed since that morning when Agent Collins first walked into the hospital," Rebecca replied. 6 months ago, I was terrified that anyone would discover my military background. Now I'm giving speeches about integrating combat experience into civilian medicine. Do you regret the loss of anonymity?" Rebecca considered the question as she watched the stars appear above the mountains that surrounded Pine Ridge County. The peaceful isolation she'd once valued had been replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more satisfying. "I regret that it took a terrorist attack to force me to be honest about who I am," she said. "But I don't regret the outcome. Hiding part of yourself doesn't protect you. It just prevents you from fully serving the people you care about." Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of service, Margaret wants to discuss your role in our new regional trauma response program. Apparently, your reputation has attracted some significant federal funding for rural emergency medicine capabilities." Rebecca laughed softly. 6 months ago, I was worried about anyone noticing my work. Now I'm apparently becoming a poster child for military-civilian medical cooperation. Is that a problem?" "No," Rebecca said after a moment's reflection. "It's an opportunity to help other veterans integrate their military training into civilian service and to improve emergency medical capabilities for rural communities that need every resource they can get." As Dr. Walsh prepared to leave, She turned back with one final question. Rebecca, do you think you'll stay in Pine Ridge permanently? Or will all these consulting offers eventually pull you back into full-time federal service? Rebecca looked out over the valley where she'd built a life that combined the best aspects of her military training with the satisfaction of civilian medical practice. Jennifer, I've learned that home isn't just a place. It's where your skills are needed and your contributions are valued. Pine Ridge became my home when I was hiding who I was. Now that I can be completely myself here, it's become something even more important. She stood and walked to the porch railing, breathing in the clean mountain air that had drawn her to Montana 4 years earlier. This community accepted me when I was pretending to be just a nurse. Now they're supporting me in being a nurse who happens to have additional capabilities. That kind of acceptance is worth more than any federal consulting contract. As Rebecca prepared for another day of service at Pine Ridge Medical Center, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a woman hiding her past to someone who'd learned to integrate all aspects of her identity into meaningful community service. The rifle remained hidden in her basement safe, available if needed, but no longer the defining symbol of who she was. She was Rebecca Chun, emergency nurse, special operations veteran, community member, and someone who discovered that true heroism isn't about the capabilities you possess, but about the willingness to use them when people need help. And Pine Ridge County was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.